I first met Richard and Donna 4 years ago, approximately, working on the MDMA for PTSD study in Vancouver, and I don't mind saying that I was in awe. I had heard of them as legendary psychedelic psychotherapists, and I certainly learned that what I knew about them then was really only the tip of the iceberg. They have impeccable scientific credentials, training from Brown University, Harvard University, Johns Hopkins, and I think we can end the list there, but it does go on. Experience working with Stanislaw Grof, founder of Psychedelic Psychotherapy, and they were among the last people in the U.S. to have FDA clearance to work with LSD. People have been there for the whole process. We couldn't find people with a richer and more deep experience in this area. Also, we're having worked with visionary psychotherapist Salvador Roque and combining Western approaches to psychotherapy with shamanic use of psychedelic medicines, including psilocybin, ketamine, and scopolamine, the dissociative. The expertise is not limited to the European use of these ancient medicines. They have direct experiential knowledge of the mushroom lineage coming from Mazatec, Curandero, Maria Sabina, and having studied among the Hmong hill tribes in Thailand. There's even a few stops with Carlos Castaneda along the way. So it's just an incredible wealth of knowledge and experience. You know, one of the many sad consequences of the prohibition of psychedelics and the war on drugs has been the disruption of transfer of expertise and practical wisdom from expert practitioners. And so for those of us who wish to continue this really promising work with these powerful medicines, we've really been severed from our lineage and deprived of the needed guidance of elders in the field that we so need to work in these sensitive areas. So that just makes me even more excited to be able to introduce Drs. Yensen and Dryer. They're directors of the Arenda Institute on Cortes Island, and very literally two of the people with the most expertise and experience in psychedelic psychotherapy in the entire world. So we're so fortunate that they've decided to locate this part of their incredible careers in BC, and kind enough to travel all the way from Cortes Island to be here with us today. So please join me in welcoming Drs. Donna Dryer and Richard Yensen.
Thank you, Zach. That's quite an introduction.
We love you too.
Yeah, we were fortunate enough to work with Dr. Walsh on this the MDMA project in Vancouver, so it was great to work together. So, and we're very honored to be here. This is my first time in the Okanagan, the first time in Kelowna, so I'm really glad to be alive right now after yesterday. So thank you very much for your persistence and patience in coming back again. I wanted to start out this talk by remembering with you the time that I met Richard, which was in 1985, just before MDMA was made illegal. So I'd been spending some time with some psychiatry residents trying to collect data that we would present before an administrative law judge in order to try to get MDMA not to be put into the category of illegal psychedelic drugs. It wasn't successful in the end, but it was a time that we had a chance to at least get to know each other and decided to work together.
When I first met her, she was sitting in the window seat on this airplane. There were only 20 people in the country invited to this conference, and we were going a week early. My friend came and kind of said, well, I'll sit next to her. And I said, okay. And he muscled his way in, and his backpack was falling off, and
his backpack fell in my lap, actually.
And she's kind of...
I'm reading the sheaf of papers that are going to be presented at this conference, and these clowns sit next to me, and I'm like, oh no, 5 hours at the California,
You know, I'd written a paper for the conference, and it was called From Mysteries to Paradigms, Humanity's Journey from Sacred Plants to Psychedelic Drugs. And nobody had this, nobody'd read it, and I'd worked really hard on it. And here he's taking off his backpack, and I know he's got it rolled up in his backpack. And so this nice young lady's helping him off with his backpack, and the next thing I know, I look over and there's my paper sitting right in front of her. And I thought, be nice, Richard. You wrote this paper because you want people to read it, but some people have all the nerve. She has taken it out of his backpack and here she is reading it, you know. So I kind of lean over in my best tone and I say, excuse me, but that's my paper you're reading, and I'm about to snatch it away when she turns and says, you must be going to this conference too.
I said, are you Richard Yensen? I mean, how often do you're reading something on an airplane when the author of it sits down next to you or 2 seats away? So anyway, so we got to talk a lot for the next few hours. But anyway, from there, and we started to do a lot more things together, and we ended up being together and falling in love and doing a lot of work together. And we realized that we had the same vision of wanting to integrate ancient spiritual healing practices into modern psychotherapy. And so we started a nonprofit foundation that we called the Arenda Institute. And the word Arenda came from something I was reading, and I hadn't ever heard of it before. But in 1989, I think we came across a book written by Howard Rheingold called They Have a Word for It. And it's a word that is used in a lot of First Nations languages across North America, across Turtle Island. And it means variously the spirit and the force of the tribe as a whole. It also means the essence, the spiritual essence that one goes out looking for when you go for a vision quest. That is your purpose for being alive this time, and is also what's useful for the collective, something that is something that helps your community or your tribe. And it seemed like it was this perfect combination of things that we were trying to do. So so we from there we've been trying lots of different ways of bringing various things into our lives and to carry the psychedelic work forward, which I hadn't learned very much about before I met Richard. So I'm going to let him take the story from here.
Well, I want to go into the ancient past. 1967, I was in college at University of California, Irvine, and I was taking a course in altered states of consciousness, one of the first courses ever to be offered in altered states of consciousness, and the textbook was by Charles Tart, called Altered States of Consciousness, a book of readings. And I was fascinated. I was fascinated with all of the possibilities, and I was particularly fascinated with psychedelics. And so with some serious trepidation, I decided to launch forward into an experiment with psychedelics of my own. And that experience was so profoundly transformative. It was so powerful for me. I left behind the young student that I was. I journeyed deeply into my conflicts, my innermost being, my memories of childhood. I found myself confronted with my connection with humanity as a whole and transported to dimensions of great love and healing and kindness and warmth, and this tremendous feeling, this is what you need to do with your life. You need to help people to have the kind of experience that you're having. I came down and my friends all said, you took too much. Don't take it too seriously. And believe me, I'm not recommending that you all run out and do this. But I knew that I had been touched really deeply inside, and that there was more to this than I thought, even in my own agreement with my friends and my own dismissal of what I had experienced. And it organized me and my thinking and my hopes and my dreams. So as life presented me with opportunities, It was like there was something in me that was ready to say, yes, that's going down the path, that's my path. And I had identified that path somehow. So it's really clear to me that God doesn't play dice with the universe, and certainly didn't play dice with my life. It wasn't an easy path to become involved with psychedelic research in the era of the most difficult condemnation of psychedelics, in the era of incredible irresponsibility on the part of elected officials in the United States of America, where a senator who was an alcoholic, who was later censured for financial misbehavior, one of the only senators ever to be censured for that, decided that psychedelics were absolutely useless and they had no possible medical value. He ignored thousands and thousands of scientific articles that said otherwise. And he created a situation in the society that was a vast disruption of the society and an intrusion into people's personal life that was unique at that time. You could be arrested for something you did to yourself. And it's been very, very difficult, and it took a field of research that had involved many different people with tremendous therapeutic potential, and with even, I had people who later became my friends who were running projects with creativity, where they felt the last thing in the world the government would ever shut down are these projects where we're demonstrating true creativity enhancement with psychedelics, because the US felt it thrived on the innovation that it created in the world, this confluence of a multicultural society with so much prejudice and so much this and that. But out of that chaos came enormous amounts of creativity. How could they afford to shut down something with a proven track record of increasing creativity? But they did. They arrived at the door and said, no more of this. Programs with autistic children, where the autistic children were being reparented by graduate students while they were under the effects of LSD and quite regressed, with amazing results happening. No more. That's shut down. Projects with neurotics, projects with alcoholics, all of these projects, no more, shut down. That's the end of it. And for me, incredibly disheartening behavior on the part of my colleagues, now colleagues, where the entire profession of psychiatry and psychology just turned around and said, oh, that was not interesting. Those results were not valid. That's not a good place. That's not the most exciting frontier in consciousness research or in understanding the mind. And it was. So I'm talking about major injury in the curiosity of a nation that then was spread for political reasons throughout the world. And so these prohibitions became a universal part of a prohibition kind of process that was fostered by one American who went to the UN and indicated the US's support of prohibitionist attitudes towards these things. And now we have them enshrined in UN edicts that are as ill-considered as the edicts of the US Congress were. And now we're coming out the other end of this. We're coming out the end where we're beginning to see again that these things do have promise. And it isn't that cure is inside of LSD or MDMA or ketamine or anything else, but it's that properly used, these things, as Robert Kennedy said in the US Senate, properly used, these things can be of service to humanity. And I'm hoping that this trajectory that we're on continues and that we're able to reintegrate these substances. But it's going to call for a tremendous revolution. It's going to call for a revolution in the way healers are trained. If you're going to work with psychedelics with people, you need to care about their story. You need to care about who they are as people. You need to make contact with them. You need to be able to support them through deep experiences and realize that there are experiences possible, aided by the administration of psychedelics in a proper environment, that are so powerful that they can be more powerful than the noxious experiences in people's lives. They can become new places for them to center their consciousness on. They can be healed from things that otherwise seemed incurable. They are our own psyche's answer to the evils of the world, to the wounds that we suffered as children, to the traumas that we can have as adults. And they don't come from the therapist. They don't come from the drug. But there's an openness to a level of consciousness inside of the person that contains experiences that are transformative. Experiences of oneness, a deep sense that all is one, whether it's internal with your eyes closed or external looking at the world. A sense of going beyond time and space, going outside of our usual realm of being. A sense that the usual things that are opposites in our life suddenly come together and are no longer opposite. They're no longer in conflict with each other. A sense of deep, intuitive knowing, of going to a place of great depth inside, of great compassion inside, of great love inside, and a sense that this is a sacred or holy experience. This is a healing experience. This is oneness. This is the answer to human suffering. People say that these kinds of experiences don't fit into words, that there isn't a way to talk about them that effectively conveys how powerful and useful they are. And the folks that have these experiences sometimes bemoan the fact that they have a beginning, a middle, and an end, that they're transient. It's not like in the 60s, I was really interested in getting high and staying there. It's not like that. It's like a peak and going up to the peak and seeing and feeling the possibilities and then coming back into ordinary consciousness. And maybe coming back into ordinary consciousness with actual instructions from yourself about how to live a better life. That was often described to me by people I worked with that were dying, people I worked with that were alcoholic, people I worked with that had normal, almost neurotic complaints, fear of going under the bridge or something, but, they were otherwise normal, otherwise ordinary folks. And so the remarkable thing about psychedelic work is that it teaches us that within each one of us is kind of the answer to our ills, the answer to our issues. But it's really a question of getting access to that dimension of your being, which is ordinarily blocked off from you by your sense of yourself, blocked off from you by your ego, my ego. Our egos are just a collection of strategies for dealing with the insults we experience growing up. And they keep us separate. And they keep us separate from these aspects of ourselves. And so that's why psychedelics can be so powerful and so helpful, because they alter our ego. They alter that sense of ourselves. And if we're held in a caring environment, in a safe place, then we can journey really deeply inside and we can find these. And it's not a question of telling somebody about it. It's a question of having these experiences really inside of ourselves.
So we're at a time where there's a confluence of a number of different major paradigm shifts. Not only are the psychedelics being reborn into our society, I'm sure all of you have read different kinds of media reports and wondered, you know, like, oh, psychedelics can be used in therapy? Whoa, you know, like that's not something that a lot of people even have heard of. It's mostly people have heard of psychedelics maybe used as abuse, you know, or maybe, you know, at music festivals, but for therapy. So the whole idea of using them as an adjunct to a therapeutic relationship has been going on at least for 50 years, but mostly they were repressed and just coming back now. So that's one major paradigm shift. There are other paradigm shifts that are also happening at the same time. In neurology, 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago now, people thought that your brain was hardwired. You were born with a certain kind of thing in your brain, and you know, you went through your life and it was hardwired like a computer, you know, like, and it didn't change. And if you had some kind of a defect, well, that's too bad. That's your cross to bear. And now they understand that our brains are adaptable every single day through our whole lives, that every single experience that we have changes the way that our neurons are connected in our brains. And so, and it turns out that psychedelics actually increase the possibility of changing those connections. So the whole idea of neuroplasticity and the idea that two people talking to each other and having an experience with each other changes each other's brains. So a mother and an infant, they change each other's brains as they're interacting. And so the whole idea of there being the possibility for things, difficult things happening between caregivers and infants from early on, but the fact that that actually could change, that that can happen, that later on in somebody's life they can actually change the way those neurons are connected in their brain. That's a whole paradigm shift in a lot of neuroscience at this point. They use the term interpersonal neurobiology to talk about that, but just even understanding how psychotherapy does work and being able to correlate brain scans that are coming into resolution that is so powerful that they can actually see cellular level, real-time changes that are happening and correlate that with somebody's self-report of what's actually going on for them, or correlating that to somebody's behavior before and after. So all of these things are actually coming together like a swirl of a spiral coming in and turning into a crest of a wave happening right now. And you guys are right on the crest of it, so it's pretty cool that you're here. So, I mean, that's what it looks like from my point of view. The other thing that I'm very concerned about, having been a psychiatrist for the last 30 years, is that so many people are really traumatized. I mean, there's a lot of people that I see with all kinds of things that they have no idea how to deal with. And I think a lot of people who are caregivers of any kind of therapist or any kind of person who's a caregiver, the kind of despair that people get into because they don't have tools or ways to actually help people with some of the levels of trauma that they have. So for me, psychedelic psychotherapy is one effective way of being able to deal with that level of difficulty that people have in their lives. So I mean, I think people are probably here because they know what a psychedelic is. But just to make sure that you know, we're talking about either a plant or a synthesized substance that causes an alteration in the time-space boundaries that a human being has, or the sense of yourself. So being able to alter that in a completely safe place and a place where you can surrender to that change allows an opening that doesn't usually happen. So that's one of the main components of psychedelic psychotherapy.
I'm going to take you back into ancient history again. That dream I had did its work, and I ended up at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, the last place in the United States that was doing federally funded research with psychedelics in psychotherapy. We had a program, well, we had a training program for professionals. We had a referred patient program where patients and therapists in the community could refer their patients and come with them for us to give them psychedelic therapy, and so that their therapists could participate with them. We had programs with alcoholics. We had a program with heroin addicts. A program for professionals where they could have up to 3 experiences with LSD in the hopes that that would be kind of a training for them in being able to understand altered states and being able to understand their patients better. And we had a program with LSD and later DPT for people with terminal cancer. So people who were dying and were experiencing anxiety and depression and fear of death. You know, it's fascinating, this place, like how can psychedelics be helpful? Well, I've described to you very briefly a way in which psychedelics were very helpful to me personally. And then building on that, I went through training and became a psychedelic therapist. And at 23 years of age, I was walking into a cancer unit in Baltimore to treat a 65-year-old man who it turns out was a labor union organizer who was dying of terminal cancer for his fear and anxiety. And it was an amazing, I knew it was going to be an amazing experience. I could feel it walking up there, and it was so beautiful. And I walked into this hospital in North Charles General Hospital, and I said, where's the room for me to do therapy in? And they said, room? I said, yes, I need to meet with this patient and I have to have some privacy. Doesn't he have a private room? No, he's on a ward. Oh, well, there's a broom closet. If we move the brooms out, it might be big enough for the 2 of you to sit in. So I started out with this guy in a broom closet. You know, first question out of his mouth, are you a social worker? No, I'm actually a psychologist. This isn't charity, is it? No, it's not charity. It's research, and you know, we've gone over that with you. I thought some of the people from my research center went over that with you and had you sign permission forms and things. Oh yeah, I think I remember something. And I said, I'm here to talk with you about what your feelings are towards your disease and your situation and your life. And he said, let me tell you about organizing unions. And he started telling me the story of his life. He started telling me how he admired his father so much as a child, and his father was involved in organizing unions, and finally the Pinkerton detectives came and beat up his father for his union activities, and his father fled to Canada. And he could only get into Canada if he had $50 in his pocket. So he worked with a bunch of buddies, and they all got together $50, and his dad went over, and then they passed the $50 back to another guy who came over, and another guy who came over. And anyway, Joe became involved many years later in organizing unions in the shipyard in Baltimore. And he described this all for me, and I'm sitting there, you know, this is fascinating. I wonder what this has to do with what he needs to tell me. So I'm going to let him tell me. And me more of the story and more of the story, and we got closer as he was telling me these stories, and he was released from the hospital and he started to come to see me at the research center. And I gave him a music session in preparation for his psychedelic session with DPT. I said, like, I just want you to listen to some music, and if you lie down while you're listening to the music and breathe, maybe you can get a little deeper into your feelings. And he said, feelings? What do you mean, feelings? I don't know what you're talking about. I was telling you about organizing labor unions. And I said, and it's very important. It's a very important story, and you can continue that story in the music if you want to. And so I started to play music for him. And then I said, some people find it really helpful, and when we do the day of your drug session, we're going to be using eye shades. So I have these eye shades here so that you can try this out. And I put the eye shades on him, and he lies down and he's listening to the music, and suddenly he goes, ah, and he pulls them off. And I said, what's wrong, Joe? What's happening? And he said, I just realized the doctor told me that I could go blind. Oh my God, I closed my eyes and I was listening to the music, and I felt like what it might be like to go blind. And I said to him, that might not be the most difficult thing that could happen. Did the doctor talk to you about your prognosis? Well, he's a very good doctor. I know he's going to take care of me. And I said, you know, nobody can tell you for sure what's going to happen, but I know that the doctor told you that your prognosis is negative, that you really, there's nothing more he can do for you. And that's why you're here with me, because we think there are experiences that you could have that would be helpful to you in facing this situation. This could be the end of your life. Oh, well, let me tell you about organizing. And, you know, he continued his stories about organizing. And slowly what emerged was his love and compassion for his fellow men who were suffering in being abused as employees of the shipbuilding company. And he told me about being beaten up by Pinkerton detectives himself, you know, and so there was violence, and then he told me about his drinking, and described this amazing role of alcohol as the working man's friend, and how he would get drunk every day when he came home from work. And when he was referred to me, they were laughing because I was very close to my mother growing up. And Bill Richards, the guy on the staff who referred the patient to me, said, Richard, this is one for you. He still lives with his mother. Ha, ha, ha. So anyway, he's telling me all these stories, and he tells me about a woman that he met and that he fell in love with. And then he grabbed, he was an electrician, and he ended up grabbing 2 wires at work that were 440 volts across the wires, and went through his heart, stopped his heart. He was taken to the hospital and revived. When the doctor revived him, he said, Joe, you got to stop drinking. So he stopped drinking. We went through all of this together, and I felt that we were getting closer and closer and closer. I had a wonderful co-therapist. Her name was Nancy Jewell. Nancy was, I used to call her my West Virginia grandma. Nancy was this gal who was about 65 years old, maybe had a great grade school education. She was a nurse's aide, but she was so warm and so kind, and she had had a string of training psychedelic experiences. I'll never forget the meeting that I witnessed between her and one of the trainees. We had a trainee who was a very kind of cocksure, full of himself psychiatrist from the Midwest, and he'd just had an LSD session, and Nancy walked in, and she was kind of cleaning up, and he mistook her almost for somebody from the cleaning staff, and he said, yep, just had my LSD session here. think I might have seen God, you know? And she said, oh, yes, when I took LSD, I thought it was very interesting. But you know what was really even more interesting was MDA. Now that I found really, truly interesting. And his jaw dropped open. Here his grandma is talking to him about all this different experience she has. Anyway, when Nancy met Joe, it was instant. The rapport was instant between the two of them. And we launched into an experience with DPT in very short order. And DPT is a very short-acting psychedelic in low dose. It only lasts about an hour. But in a high dose, like Joe was going to be given, it's a 4 to 6 hour experience. So we gave him the injection, and it started. He was very frightened for a moment. And then he talked about his childhood, his father, seeing his father beaten, but this time he cried about his father. And he talked about his love for the working men, and he cried about that. And then he talked about being an Irishman, and he said he could feel the longing of his people coming to the United States for decent work. And that was his struggle, to make sure that that work was decent, that people had to do, and that they weren't abused in the working. And then he said he could feel blood in his veins, and he could see the American flag, and he could feel the longing for all of these things in his heart, and that he was happy that he devoted his life to doing this. It was beautiful. He took us then through the rest of his whole life to the place where he'd fallen in love with this woman and that didn't work out for him to marry her, to the whole place of getting his cancer, and to a full realization that this was the end of his life. And he was full of love and full of beauty and full of warmth. And that was just a stunning experience to be present for, and to see how he changed as a result of it. When his family came in at the end, they couldn't believe the change that he had, and he was on no pain medication at all. He'd been on considerable opiate medication for the pain, and he was just beaming and happy and contactful and asking them how they were doing rather than complaining about how he was feeling. So that's kind of an example of psychedelic therapy, and psychedelic therapy in the hands of myself as a neophyte. It was about caring about Joe and allowing him to care about me. I remember when he died, it was headlines in the obituary section of papers in Baltimore, "Mr. Union dies." And I knew how much it meant to him to be called that.
So just a few more minutes. We want to leave enough time for people to ask questions. So just a few general major concepts around psychedelic psychotherapy. One of the things that psychedelics do is they introduce chaos into the brain. And they actually deactivate the roof brain, the cortex part of the brain. And they actually deactivate the part of the brain that keeps us remembering that we end at the end of our skin. And so when you're on a certain dose of a major psychedelic, you start to actually dissolve or feel less and less like you end at the end of your skin, and you become more and more melted into being a part of other things and identified with other things outside of you. And that just, it's coming from changing our brain, but what if the illusion is that we're separate, and that we're really not separate, and that what our evolution has done so that we can move around as a creature in, we bump into things. What if that evolution created that part of our brain so that we could hunt animals and run through the forest? But what if it's really an illusion in some ways? So, or maybe both things are real, and it's just in different places we perceive them in different ways. So, when you're not feeling separate and you're feeling one with everything, it actually allows you to gain knowledge that you wouldn't have in the state of consciousness where you're feeling separate. And so the whole idea that we can gain knowledge and learn things about who we are and things about the world from different states of consciousness is also a big part of the whole idea of changing our consciousness. So, and doing psychedelic psychotherapy is a part of that, so that if you have that as part of your understanding or your belief going into a psychedelic session, you may be less surprised when that happens to you. The other thing that happens is if you are taking a psychedelic with somebody that you trust completely, somebody who you could be born with or you could die with, and in a setting that's completely safe and completely protected, such that you can surrender into the experience as a teacher and learn, even if the experience is difficult or painful, that you move towards it and open your arms to it and learn from it and learn from that experience as a teacher to you. So I think those are the most profound things that I've learned doing psychedelic psychotherapy. And when I've been privileged to be able to have that kind of setting for myself, it's been an incredible learning. So I think this kind of work is a kind of loving, and it's a kind of way of being that I think can help change things for the better in our world. It inspires me as, in the work that I do, and it makes it possible for me to imagine, being a psychiatrist and not being in despair, that there are things that we can actually do. There are experiences that are transformative and possible for people. And, I am excited about seeing what's possible to happen now.
I want to do one more experience from the past, if I can. Are you willing?
Well, we want to leave some time.
Yeah,
too.
yeah. Sharon was a physician's assistant, and she had been a heme tech person, a hematology technician, and she had diagnosed herself with Waldenstrom's transmacroglobulinemia, a rare blood cancer that often doesn't take people for a long, long time. And she was a patient of mine in my private practice. And then she went downhill. The anemia that came along with this got so severe that she would walk up the stairs to my office on the second floor and she'd be out of breath by the time she got to the office. And I said to her, since you have a cancer and it's looking pretty terminal, I can offer you the possibility to have an experience with LSD. You meet the criteria for inclusion in our study. Are you willing? And she said yes. And so we did it, but she went downhill even more. And she ended up in North Charles General Hospital. Again, we were associated with one of the physicians there. And she was on a ward, but when I went to give her her session at the hospital, they cleared the ward out. And so here was a small ward that she had all to herself. And I brought the music for the session, and the co-therapist came with me, and we gave her her LSD. Now, she had been in therapy for many, many, many years for all kinds of different neurotic complaints that she had, one would be dealt with and would go away, and another one would come up. And she got the LSD, and she was 80 pounds. She'd been 165 pounds. She was 80 pounds at that point, and just pale as could be, looked to be on death's door. And she's listening to the music, and suddenly she starts to smile. And wow, I hadn't seen her smile for many, many years. And she smiles, she's got eye shades on, and she pulls the covers off, and she's wearing pajamas, and she kind of gets up on her haunches, you know, kind of like kneeling on the bed with this crazy kind of squeaky springs on this hospital bed, and she's in this posture, and she reaches out with her hands and she goes, "Finally, I'm in the spotlight. I have my spotlight. I have my day." And she was bouncing like that for 4 hours, smiling and regaling and sometimes waving. And we'd say, "What's going on, Mary? What's happening? What's happening?" And she'd say, "I finally have my time. I'm on my horses." Afterwards, when I'm working for her with the integration of this, what happened to her? Well, her sister had, throughout her life, kind of tortured her older sister, and demeaned her and put her down, and she suddenly had this experience of being in a circus, in a tent, with 3 white horses, and she had a foot on each of the outside horses, and there was a middle horse, and she had the reins, and she was riding these 3 white horses around the ring as everybody in the audience was clapping for her. And she was just drinking in this feeling of mattering, this feeling of being a person, this feeling of being loved that was so, so powerful for her. She came out of this experience. She went back up to 165 pounds. The physicians in the hospital, and God knows they may have been right, said, "Oh, she responded to the chemotherapy. Isn't that wonderful?" But we knew it was just so time-linked with this experience that she'd had. Now, she did die eventually of the Waldenströms, but the experience seemed to be one that for her was immensely reparative of so many experiences that in the integration of this, she went over and talked about insult after insult from her parents and from her sister, and stuff that she had never brought up in therapy before. She would bring up a lot of the symptomatology, and she would talk about a lot of things, but getting her to talk about her biography was very, very difficult. So a remarkable breakthrough, and just another example of how useful psychedelics can be. In this case, it's with people who are facing death, but they can be equally useful for people with trauma in their lives. It can allow a recontextualization, a kind of a going back to the traumatic event, which is what post-traumatic stress disorder is all about, that's happening to people all the time against their will. And if you're in a safe environment, the direction of consciousness seems to be that, and if it's not a judging environment, the person will go back, but then if they're safe and they're supported, they recontextualize. They experience and may scream out in the pain of what happened, but they have a new context for that memory. And the context is the positive experience of being held in a caring relationship while they go through it. And so then the retelling of that's part of their being in the world every day, now has another element that isn't noxious. And so the impact of the whole PTSD-inducing trauma diminishes.
Do you want to talk about the vision of the future at all?
Ah, yeah. You know, this really, I mean, what we're hoping to do is to inspire you for your own work, for your own lives, to get excited and to be part of what we see as a coming revolution in this area. How to do that?
Well, mostly that it is possible. It's very important to get training and background in understanding the psychodynamic levels of things, but also to understand what's possible in terms of beyond the psychodynamic and into the spiritual aspects. But it's really important to get background and training. So I just encourage people to do that, and that things are really opening up now. And we can envision actually having centers where people are trained and clinics where people can go and have initiatory experiences. And I mean, I'm hoping to see that in my lifetime, but you guys certainly will. So I think that's a good place to end and open it up for some questions. Yeah. So thank you very much.